Okay, to get into Vatican II for a moment. Vatican II is a major development in church history in the 20th century, particularly as it relates to the Catholic Church. In 1958, John the 23rd was elected Pope. John the 23rd was an old man. He was elderly when he was elected Pope, and he was thought to be something of a quiet caretaker of the church, someone who was kind of like a sort of a placeholder for the next pope, who was going to be a younger man. But 3 months into his pontificate, he announces the calling of an ecumenical council for the universal church, which was going to meet, which would start in 1962. He makes this call in February of 1959, just a little bit after he is elected Pope. This was really a significant announcement because it's the very first ecumenical council since 1870, which was the first Vatican Council, Vatican I. Vatican I was a reaction against modernism, and it's part of the same kind of movement that a reaction against modernism we see in America with the rise of fundamentalism and Protestantism. But Vatican II becomes a very important, a very significant, probably the most significant church council since Trent, going all the way back to the 1540s. And Vatican II meets from 1962 until 1965. It's the largest gathering of bishops in church history that will convene in Rome. It convenes in October of 1962, which is the same month that the Cuban Missile Crisis occurs, this great confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union over the Soviets placing missile installations in Cuba. Now, John the 23rd thought that this council would probably last about 8 weeks. It goes for 3 years. All proceedings were in Latin. Sounds like a party. The speakers had to turn in all of their speeches in writing beforehand, which meant that there was no formal dialogue and there was no formal debate in the official proceedings of Vatican II. But the dialogue, the debate, the discourse went on in restaurants, in pubs, in social settings offline. And so this is sort of an interesting way to advance arguments, not during the official meeting times, but in hotels and monasteries and other places where people meet in Rome socially. For John also wanted to bring sort of an innovation into this particular church council. John wanted the conclusions of this church council, the decisions of the church council, to arise sort of from the bottom up and not so much from the top down. He didn't want Vatican II to be the production of a pope pronouncing its decisions from the top up, but he wanted there to be collegiality among the bishops. He wanted the major decisions to come from beneath, from the bishops of the world who were gathered there, to come up and to bubble up and to influence the church in that way. And John writes a very important encyclical. He writes this. It comes out in April of 1963. The encyclical was called Pacem in Terris. And this thing is produced. This encyclical is produced just 3 months before he dies of stomach cancer. He advocates for human rights. He advocates for the common good. And he advocates for the duty of governments to protect and promote the common good and human rights. He also stresses the need for nuclear disarmament, which is interesting in context because just a few months earlier, the world had come to the brink of nuclear war. Now, the major results of Vatican II, which I'll just hit on briefly, there are 3 major results, 3 major developments that come out of Vatican II that really change the way that the Catholic Church sees itself and the way the Catholic Church relates to its own membership and to the outside world as a whole. Again, Vatican II, the importance of Vatican II really can't be overstated. Represents the end of Tridentine Catholicism that begins in the 1540s as a reaction against the Protestant Reformation. The first result, or the first development that comes out of Vatican II, is an emphasis on pluralism, the recognition of the Church of the reality of pluralism, that the Church is no longer simply a European institution, and that Christianity is no longer sort of a European religion, a regional religion, a Western religion. It's a religion that is now an international religion, encompassing parts of the world that in the 1540s the Church was not present in at all. It revises the Church's sort of stance and relationship to other faiths, particularly Judaism and Protestantism. For example, the Church in Vatican II officially absolves the Jews for responsibility of the crucifixion of Christ, which is a major step for the Catholic Church to take. And this decision is deeply influenced by the horrors of the Holocaust in World War II. Also, the Catholic Church no longer anathematizes Protestants. There's a relief for us all, right? No longer are Protestants condemned to hell, but now Protestants are going to be defined as separated brethren. And also, in light of pluralism, the Catholic Church is going to take a very strong stance on religious freedom. The conscience must be respected, even if the conscience leads the individual astray. This is going to be the official position of the Catholic Church as a result of Vatican II. It's a huge step, and probably the most important figure in the advocacy for religious freedom is a theologian by the name of John Courtney Murray, who writes a work called Dignitatis Humani. And he writes this in the context of the Cold War and communism. The Soviet Union, communist China are suppressing religious movements, religious faiths in their regimes, and the Western nations that are led by the United States are seeing themselves in very religious terms. And so this is the context for the rise in the Catholic interest in religious freedom. And of course, the Catholic Church is heavily persecuted in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and in China and in other places where the communists dominate. This view of religious freedom is also, one other thing I should say, is really motivated by a real emphasis on the imago Dei, humanity being created in the image of God. It's not based on some kind of a postmodern belief that all roads lead to God. So it's important to stress that. If you read John Courtney Murray's writings, you see that there is an objective basis for religious freedom. So pluralism is one of the major results. Another major result is the Church's view on authority, on religious authority. Now, just as John the 23rd wanted Vatican II to be defined by collegiality among the bishops, rather than the decisions coming from the Pope and being transmitted to the Church from the Pope from the top up, Church authority was now going to be defined as a rule by collegiality. Collegiality of bishops and a delegation of authority to indigenous leaders in congregations all over the world. Laypersons are also no longer going to be merely spectators in the Mass. So prior to this, of course, the Mass is going to be celebrated. It's going to be communicated only in Latin. And so if you didn't know Latin, if you didn't speak Latin, if you had no idea what was being said, you were just there, and you didn't understand what was being said. You didn't understand the content of the Mass. The verbal content of the Mass, you received the elements of the Eucharist. And that was the real stress of the Catholic Mass. But with the Mass is now going to be communicated in the vernacular languages. Of course, the lay persons are now going to be able to understand the language of the Mass, which is going to be a massive step. And now the lay persons were no longer going to be spectators, but they would actually be active participants in it. Also, there are going to be loosened restrictions in terms of meat eating is no longer going to be forbidden on Fridays, and priests could now wear pants also. And probably the most controversial element that comes out of Vatican II is the Church's stance on birth control. In Vatican II, the Church is going to acknowledge that the Catholic stance on birth control is not mainstream. They don't lift the ban on birth control in Vatican II. It's probably the most conservative element that's in Vatican II. But Vatican II does affirm that Catholics can learn from married couples about birth control. The successor to John the 23rd is Paul VI. And Paul VI writes an encyclical called Humani Vitae in July of 1968. And in this, he again affirms the ban on birth control and says that the only birth control that the Church will allow is going to be the Rhythm method. Right? Now, not much to say about Vatican II. I'll let you do some reading on Vatican II in your studies. But just a couple of words about the legacies of Vatican II. Conservatives worry that Vatican II goes way too far. Liberals want it to go a lot farther, right? So, in Vatican II, people on both sides of the ideological spectrum are unsatisfied. Conservatives object to Mass being communicated in the vernacular. They object to lay participation in the Mass. And liberals object to the continuance of the ban on birth control. Joseph Ratzinger, who will become Pope Benedict XVI in 2005. He was born in 1927. He's still alive as of this recording. He warned that the Church was forgetting the effects and the scope of original sin in Vatican II. He said that the Church, as the city of God, should hold itself aloof from the city of man and not be influenced by the culture. He thought that Vatican II was too heavily influenced by worldly culture. But nevertheless, in Vatican II, the global South, the growth of the Church in the global South is encouraged. And Vatican II is really an impetus for explosive growth of the Catholic Church in the global South. Vatican II will be an inspiration, for example, in the independence movements of those remaining colonies in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in the 1960s and 1970s. Through lay participation in the global South, liberation theology is spread in places like the Philippines and Latin America in particular. And really what you have is, as I said, an explosive growth in the Church in the global South, which is a good thing, right? There are positives and then there are negatives, the emphasis on liberation theology being a negative thing with Vatican II. But nevertheless, I'll let you read further about that in your readings, and we're going to shift gears in the final lecture and look at the civil rights movement.